The transit pod did not dock. It integrated. Silas Rook felt the subtle shift in pressure deep in his inner ear. A soft, wet locking mechanism that sounded more like a joint snapping into a socket than metal meeting metal. For a man who had spent his entire adult life decoding acoustic anomalies in deep space systems, the Aurelian Concorde's Central Diplomatic Station was a nightmare of sensory overload. He had been pulled from his bunk on the human flagship less than 24 hours ago, shoved onto this vessel with zero briefing materials and a single, cryptic directive from command. You are the only one suitable for the current variance. Variance. A polite human word for an error no one knew how to fix. Silas stepped out of the airlock and into the observation sector. Immediately, the air tasted different, heavy, with something electric and metallic, like the ozone tang right before a lightning strike. The station was not built, it was grown. The walls around him were a sweeping lattice of pale, bone-like structures and translucent membranes. But it was the acoustics that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The ambient hum was not the steady drone of atmospheric recyclers. It was a rhythmic, shifting pulse. It reacted. When his heart rate spiked upon seeing the sheer scale of the architecture, the corridor's luminescence darkened to a bruised purple, and the hum lowered an octave, pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. The station was listening. It felt as though it were eavesdropping on the very electrical firing of his synapses. He followed the pathway dictated by the shifting light, boots making dull thuds on the bio-resin floor, until the corridor opened into a vast, sweeping viewing deck. Beyond the immense curve of the primary viewport hung the Aurelian capital world, a jewel of impossibly organized cityscapes, glowing with synchronized pulses of gold and white. But Silas did not look at the planet. His attention snapped to the figure standing alone before the glass. Neva Solrin was a study in alien grace, yet fundamentally wrong to the eyes of her own kind. She was slender, towering over Silas by at least half a foot, with skin that shimmered like crushed pearls. Beneath the surface of her flesh, a network of bioluminescent veins pulsed with soft, cyan light. Silas had studied the Aurelian biological profiles. Their subdermal light networks were supposed to pulse in perfect harmony with the ambient rhythm of their surroundings and their peers. Niva's light was out of sync. It was a jarring, arrhythmic flicker, while the room hummed a slow, majestic waltz. Her veins flashed in a frantic, isolated staccato. Behind her stood two Aurelian honor guards, massive entities clad in ceremonial armor that seemed to grow seamlessly out of their own shoulders. Their lights pulsed in flawless, terrifying unison with the room. They looked at Neva not with hatred, but with a sterile, detached pity one might reserve for a dying animal. Silas cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his uniform. Diplomatic Envoy Rook. I was told to. I am defective. Her voice cut through the ambient hum of the room like a silver blade. It was not loud, but it possessed a heartbreaking calmness. She did not turn away from the viewport. Silas tapped the small translation device hooked over his ear. It was state-of-the-art tech, capable of parsing over 10,000 dialects. Apologies, he said, keeping his tone measured. My translator must be catching a bad frequency. It sounded like you just called yourself defective. The translation is perfectly accurate. Envoy Rook. Neva finally turned to face him. Her eyes were deep, fathomless pools of silver. There is no closer equivalent in your language. In mine, the word is Kethar. It means a piece that ruins the whole. Silas waited for the guards to correct her, to offer some diplomatic platitude about differing cultural perspectives. Instead, a chilling, heavy silence fell over the room. The guards' lights dimmed in a synchronized display of mourning and agreement. That was the exact, clinical term her species used for her. He stepped closer, fighting the instinct to lower his voice. I find it hard to believe a civilization that grows spaceships out of bone and light makes mistakes. The chorus makes no mistakes, Neva replied softly. Only the individuals do. Over the next few minutes, the reality of her existence began to unravel before him. Silas knew the basics of the Aurelian chorus. It was the foundation of their entire empire, a telepathic and emotional synchronization network. It was not a hive mind, but rather an orchestra. Every Aurelian retained their thoughts, but their emotions, their societal reflexes, and their underlying consciousness were perpetually woven into a grand, harmonized symphony. To feel joy was to share a note of it with 100 billion others. To feel sorrow was to have it immediately dispersed and absorbed by the collective. Neva could not connect. She explained it with that same terrifying detachment. Since birth, she had been a discordant note. She could hear the chorus, the beautiful, overwhelming song of her people, but she could never sing back. Her emotional output was entirely contained within her own mind, her own body. To the Aurelian Concord, she was static on a pristine radio broadcast, a living, breathing glitch. Silas leaned against the railing beside her, crossing his arms. He relied on the one defense mechanism humans had perfected over millennia of staring into the dark. Well, Silas muttered, I suppose that makes you an absolute nightmare at parties. Nobody likes the one person who won't join the sing-along. It was a dry, hollow joke, meant to puncture the suffocating solemnity of the room. It failed spectacularly. The ambient hum of the observation deck spiked into a sharp, dissonant whine. The two guards shifted their weight, their subdermal lights flaring an angry, warning crimson. The air pressure dropped. Silas realized his mistake almost instantly. In a society where every thought and emotion was a shared, physical reality, words were not cheap. They were not tools for deflection. They were ceremonial. They carried the weight of law. Neva raised a slender hand, and the guards settled back into their statuesque stillness. The red faded back to a unified, rhythmic blue. You use humor to mask discomfort, she observed, tilting her head. A fascinating evolutionary compensation, but there is no need to mask anything here. Silas Rook. My condition is a fact. And facts must be resolved. Resolved how? Silas asked, his humor completely evaporating. He did not like the cold, clinical shape of that word. Neva looked back down at the golden cityscapes of the capital. I am to undergo a procedure tomorrow. In your tongue. It translates roughly to the quieting. A medical procedure. A neural realignment, she corrected. It will not cease my biological functions. I will still breathe. I will still consume nutrients. But the misaligned pathways of my consciousness will be pruned. They will sever the parts of my mind that create the static. Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He was an engineer. He knew what happened when you bypassed a faulty circuit to make a machine run smoothly. You didn't fix the circuit, you killed it, and rerouted the power. They are going to lobotomize you, Silas said, the harsh human word tasting like ash in his mouth. They are going to carve out whatever makes you distinct, just so you stop annoying their collective ear. It is a repair, Neva stated, though for the first time, her voice lacked the absolute conviction of the guards behind her. It will bring peace to the chorus, and it will grant me silence. I will no longer have to listen to the song I am forbidden to join. Silas stared at her. The subdermal lights under her pearlescent skin continued their erratic, lonely dance. Flash. Pause. Flash, flash. A desperate code from a sinking ship. He realized then what he was looking at. She was not looking out at the city to say goodbye to it. She was looking at it because it was the thing that was going to erase her. The true horror of the situation settled over Silas, cold and absolute. Neva Solrin was not afraid of the physical pain of the quieting. Her composure was not bravery in the face of torture. It was the resignation of a ghost. She was terrified of the aftermath. She was facing the absolute certainty that after tomorrow, her body would walk and talk and blend perfectly into the background noise of the Aurelian Concord. And not a single soul in this vast, shimmering galaxy would remember that she had once been a whole, distinct person in her own right. She would be overwritten, a deleted file in a flawless system. The walls of the station pulsed with a slow, steady heartbeat, indifferent to the erratic, dying light of the woman standing beside him. Silas felt his own heart rate begin to rise. A chaotic, uncoordinated rhythm of anger and deep, uniquely human rebellion. The sheer cruelty of the impending erasure twisted something deep inside Silas. His diplomatic training, the months of rigorous psychological conditioning meant to keep him an impartial observer among the stars, simply evaporated. He could not stand there and let this woman believe her individuality was a disease requiring surgical extraction. "No," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a jagged, raw edge. "You are perfect." He only meant to throw a lifeline, a desperate, inherently human attempt to offer comfort in the face of absolute despair. He expected a sad smile, perhaps a polite dismissal. He did not expect the universe to snap in half. The instant the translation device at his collar emitted the local equivalent of his words, the ambient environment of the observation deck suffered a catastrophic failure. The omnipresent, rhythmic hum of the station did not simply fade. It was violently severed. The resulting silence was so absolute, it hit Silas like a physical blow to the chest, momentarily stealing his breath. Then, the architecture itself reacted. The sweeping, bone-white lattice of the bioresin walls shuddered violently. The serene, unified blue illumination that bathed the room shattered. The light did not die, it inverted. A blinding, searing gold erupted from the structural veins of the station, casting harsh, razor-sharp shadows across the floor. The smooth, organic surfaces of the walls began to writhe and restructure, extruding aggressive, fractal geometries that looked infinitely older and far more hostile than the elegant curves of modern Aurelian design. The two heavily armored honor guards, who had previously stood with the motionless grace of statues, shattered their composure in an instant. It was a terrifying sight. Entities built for perfect, synchronized stoicism were suddenly gripped by chaotic panic. The guard on the left lunged forward, a massive, gauntleted hand reaching out as if he could physically snatch the words out of the air and crush them before they settled. He missed Silas by a fraction of an inch, his momentum carrying him into a stumbling halt. The guard on the right did not attack. Instead, he collapsed heavily onto one knee. The subdermal light network beneath his armor went berserk, flashing an aggressive, blinding sequence of crimson and black, a localized distress signal screaming into the void. Silas staggered back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Hey, stand down, He stopped. His eyes darted past the panicked guards to Neva. Amidst the violent architectural upheaval and the sudden terror of her escorts, Neva Solrin stood perfectly, unnervingly still. Silas stared at her, mesmerized and horrified. The jarring, arrhythmic flicker beneath her skin, the chaotic staccato that marked her as a glitch, had vanished. Her subdermal network was no longer flashing in isolation. It had flooded with a steady, brilliant, unbroken luminescence. The cyan light under her pearlescent flesh was stable, radiating a profound and terrifying serenity. She looked down at her own hands, her silver eyes wide with an emotion that transcended shock. She looked like a machine that had spent a lifetime searching for a signal, only to suddenly receive the master command code it was built to execute. A sharp, piercing chime emanated from Silas's earpiece. It was not the standard notification of a completed translation. It was a deep system override from the linguistic core, a holographic display projected directly onto his retina, glowing in stark red lettering. Critical contextual override. Ancient dialect detected. Human phrasing. You are perfect. Local historical translation. I recognize you as whole. Status, lexical binding confirmed. Before Silas could process the text, a deafening biological crunch echoed through the chamber. The massive, transparent viewport overlooking the capital planet slammed shut, sealed behind layers of thick, opaque bone plating. The exits sealed themselves with the same violent finality. The air pressure in the room spiked, growing heavy, stale, and metallic. It felt like standing inside a sealed tomb. "Envoy Rook!" the kneeling guard gasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. He did not rise from the floor. "You have doomed us all." "I gave her a compliment," Silas yelled, throwing his hands up in defense, desperately trying to de-escalate the sudden nightmare. "It is a human figure of speech. It means I think she is fine the way she is. I did not hack your station. I did not issue a command. Open the doors." "There are no accidental declarations within a living structure," the other guard snarled, finally regaining his footing, though his hand rested nervously on the hilt of a weapon that seemed grown from his own forearm. "You spoke voluntarily. The archive heard you. You have invoked the binding of the witness pair. It is a protocol that predates the chorus by 10,000 cycles." Neva finally raised her head. The steady, unbroken light beneath her skin cast a halo around her features. "He recognized my pattern," she said, her voice echoing with a strange, resonant authority that had not been there a moment ago. "And the architecture verified the claim." "It is a corruption," the armed guard shouted, though he took a distinct step backward from her. "The court will purge this room. They will burn the atmospheric processors to erase the resonance of those words." Silas realized his dry wit and casual humanity had just collided head-on with a society where thoughts and words were literal, physical architecture. He had not just offered sympathy, he had inadvertently activated a forgotten legal framework embedded in the very DNA of the space station. He had legally, fundamentally declared that the Empire's broken citizen was entirely flawless, and the ancient ship had agreed with him. The armed guard raised his weapon, the bioluminescent barrel glowing with lethal intent. "Step away from the defective human. The lockdown will hold until the Inquisition arrives. If you move, I will sever your vital functions." "She is not defective," Silas shot back, his own stubbornness flaring up despite the weapon pointed at his chest. "Your own walls just proved it." Before the guard could respond, the station intervened again. It did not happen at the sealed exit, nor at the blast-shielded window. It happened directly behind Silas. The solid, impenetrable bone lattice of the rear wall began to dissolve. It did not break or shatter. It melted away like wax exposed to a furnace, pulling back in perfectly symmetrical rings. A rush of cold, ancient air spilled into the observation deck, carrying the scent of dust and ozone. The dissolved wall revealed a massive, yawning corridor bathed in a low, pulsating amber light. The two guards froze completely. The armed guard lowered his weapon, his expression slackening into absolute dread. "That is impossible," the kneeling guard whispered, staring into the amber depths. "That is the deep root. Not even the Archons possess the biometric resonance to open the ancestral veins." The ship was ignoring the current regime. It was ignoring the guards, the weapons, and the modern laws of the Aurelian Concord. The ancient system had heard Silas's declaration, validated Neva's response, and offered them a path that no living citizen of the Empire was permitted to walk. Neva stepped forward, moving with a fluid grace that seemed newly unlocked. She stopped beside Silas, looking toward the open threshold. She did not ask for his permission, nor did she wait for his guidance. The shared, unspoken reality of their situation hung heavily between them. They were sealed in a room with hostile guards, but the station itself was offering an escape route. Silas took a deep breath, the cold, ancient air filling his lungs. He stepped past the threshold, crossing from the modern, hostile observation deck into the forgotten amber corridor. As his boots touched the floor of the ancient passageway, the amber light flared, illuminating the true nature of their escape route. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, his blood running cold. The corridor was not empty. Lining both sides of the massive, cavernous hallway were hundreds of towering, luminescent figures. They were encased in translucent, crystalline pillars, standing perfectly motionless. They were Aurelians, their ancient armor detailed with the same aggressive fractal geometry that now adorned the observation deck. As Silas stepped deeper into the hall, the heads of the figures within the pillars turned in absolute unison, their featureless faces tracking his movement. They were not statues. They were observers. They were waiting. Silas looked back at Neva, whose skin was glowing with the same terrifying, beautiful resonance as the figures in the walls. He realized then the true magnitude of his mistake. He had not just comforted the wrong person. With 3 simple words, he had reached down into the dark, pulled the pin on a secret the Empire had buried millennia ago, and casually tossed it onto the diplomatic table. The amber corridor had deposited them not into a holding cell, but into an amphitheater of terrifying symmetry. This was the harmonic court. Tiers of bioluminescent seats spiraled upward into a vaulted ceiling of dark, polished resin. Occupying these seats were hundreds of Aurelian elites. Their subdermal lights pulsed in a synchronized rhythm so flawless, it made Silas's eyes ache. It was a visual representation of a single, massive heartbeat. At the center of the lowest tier stood Archon Vare. He was taller than the others, his robes woven from threads of spun light that shifted in deep, authoritative indigos. When he spoke, his voice did not just project from his mouth. It seemed to resonate from the walls, amplified by the silent agreement of the hundreds of minds connected to him. "You have invoked the lexicon of the First Keepers. Envoy Rook," Vare stated, the tone devoid of malice but heavy with absolute law. "A verbal confirmation of wholeness, delivered without coercion, within a sentient diagnostic chamber. Under treaties signed thousands of cycles before your species discovered combustion. We are bound to process this event." Silas stood beside Neva in the center of the depression. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, projecting a calm he did not feel. "I am a diplomat, Archon. I was offering comfort. I am entirely ignorant of your ancient jurisprudence." "Ignorance is not a shield against resonance," Vare countered smoothly. The entire court shifted its hue to a slightly cooler shade of blue in unison. "However, the conquered is pragmatic. We recognize the profound biological and cultural disparities between our peoples. We offer a diplomatic egress." Vare descended one step. "Retract the statement. Formally cite a severe translational anomaly and cultural misunderstanding. In exchange, the system will downgrade her status back to unconfirmed deviance. The disruption will be scrubbed, and the citizen will proceed to her scheduled quieting. The human delegation will face no penalty." It was a neat, bureaucratic bow, tying up a messy anomaly. Just say it was a mistake. Walk away, and let them erase the woman standing next to him. Silas looked at Vare, then up at the hundreds of synchronized glowing veins in the gallery. "I have a question," Silas said, his voice grating against the perfect acoustics of the room. "I am an acoustics engineer by trade. I study signal integrity. If your chorus is as perfect and unified as you claim, why are you so terrified of a little static? If your harmony is absolute, why does one out-of-tune note require a surgical strike to silence it?" The gallery's light flared into a sharp, warning amber. The question was not just disrespectful. It was blasphemous. Vare's expression hardened. "You view the chorus through the lens of tyranny, Envoy. You see suppression where there is only a shield. The Archon raised a hand, and the lighting in the amphitheater dimmed, replaced by a holographic projection manifesting in the center of the room. It was not a star map, but a chaotic, swirling vortex of absolute darkness that seemed to devour the light around it. Thousands of cycles ago, our empire spanned 1,000 systems, Ver explained, his voice taking on a heavy, historical cadence. We were diverse. We were chaotic. We were much like you. And then, the night tide breached our galactic arm. The projection expanded, showing the darkness washing over vibrant, distinct planets, leaving behind nothing but dead rock and silent atmospheres. It is not a fleet. It is not an empire. It is a mimetic storm, Ver continued. A cosmic phenomenon that feeds on cognitive discord, societal friction, and emotional chaos. It tracks the noise of divided civilizations and consumes their consciousness. We lost billions in the first 10 years. We realized then that diversity of mind was not a strength. It was a beacon drawing a predator. The chorus was not forged to enslave us. It was forged to save us. We synchronized our minds, our emotions, our very souls into a single, unified frequency. We became a flat line to the tide. We survived because we learned to be one. Ver extinguished the projection. The unified blue light of the court returned. Citizens like Neva Solrin are not merely tragic anomalies. They are fractures in the armor. A single, distinct emotional signature radiating into the void is a flare shot into the dark. If we allow her discord to persist, the tide will find us again. The quieting is an act of species survival. Now, Envoy, retract your statement. Silas absorbed the weight of the history. It made sense. It was cold, ruthless, terrifying logic. He turned his head to look at Neva. Throughout the entire exchange, she had not spoken, but she had changed. When he first met her on the observation deck, she had held herself with a subtle hunch, a physical manifestation of an apology for her own existence. Now, she stood perfectly straight. Her chin was lifted. The cyan light beneath her skin was not chaotic. It was burning with a steady, fierce independence. She was looking at the Archon, at the hundreds of elites who wanted to erase her, and she was not flinching. Before Silas could open his mouth to answer the Archon, the floor of the harmonic court began to vibrate. It was not a structural failure. It was a deep, resonant thrum that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of their bones. The synchronized blue light of the court's audience abruptly flickered, overridden by a surge of brilliant, archaic gold erupting from the seams in the bioresin floor. A synthesized voice, vast and metallic, boomed through the chamber. It did not speak Aurelian modern standard. It spoke a jarring, jagged dialect that the translation device in Silas's ear struggled to parse before finally feeding the words to his brain. Witness pair established, claim of wholeness registered. Integrity remains unverified. Protocol mandates descent to the mnemonic core for final validation. Chaos erupted in the gallery. The perfect synchronization of the elites shattered into a cacophony of panicked, discordant colors. Archon Ver took a step back, his indigo robes flashing with streaks of agitated crimson. "Override," Ver shouted, raising his hands toward the vaulted ceiling. "The core has been sealed for 600 cycles. The current regime denies access." "Access is not a petition," the ancient voice of the station rumbled, the sheer volume rattling Silas's teeth. "Access is a biological right of the witness pair. Path is open." A circular section of the floor directly beneath Silas and Neva suddenly detached. It did not drop. It smoothly descended, forming a perfectly spherical elevator platform, bathed in the station's ancient golden light. The elites in the gallery were standing now, their voices merging into a unified shout of protest. Archon Ver stared down at them, his face a mask of furious disbelief. The ancient laws embedded in the station's living architecture were fundamentally overriding his authority. Worse, a woman designated as defective and an alien outsider were being granted entry into the holiest, most restricted vault in the Empire. Envoy Rook, Vare's voice cut through the din, desperate and commanding. If you step into the deep root, you forfeit your diplomatic immunity. You will be declaring war on the fundamental survival mechanism of this empire. Retract the words. Say it was an error. The platform was already descending. Silas looked up at the furious, terrified face of the Archon. He understood the stakes now. He understood that this was not just about saving one woman from a lobotomy. It was about tearing down a wall that an entire civilization used to hide from the dark. He looked beside him. Neva was watching him, her silver eyes reflecting the golden light of the descending shaft. She was not asking him to save her. She was merely waiting for his truth. Silas turned his gaze back up to the Archon, folding his arms across his chest as the gallery began to disappear from view above them. I meant exactly what I said, Silas replied, his voice calm and unyielding. I retract nothing. The platform plunged into the dark, leaving the panicked harmony of the court behind. The descent felt less like a mechanical plunge, and more like sinking through the rings of a colossal, living tree. The spherical platform finally settled at the absolute nadir of the station. As the glowing threshold dilated, Silas and Neva stepped out of the transport and into a breathtaking impossibility. This was not a machine room. It was a biological cathedral of light and memory. Vast, sweeping archways of translucent cartilage soared into a vaulted canopy, glowing with the soft, iridescent hues of a deep ocean trench. Unlike the sterile, calculated architecture of the upper levels, this space felt wild, untamed, and profoundly alive. Suspended in the air were millions of crystalline motes, drifting like luminescent snow, each one a compressed packet of ancient data. The floor was a shallow pool of liquid silver that parted around their boots, rippling with every step to reveal constellations of dormant synapses beneath the surface. As they walked deeper into the sanctum, the air grew thick with a sparkling, breathable aerosol. The moment Silas inhaled, his vision blurred, and the physical boundaries of his own body seemed to dissolve. The ancient protocol of the chamber had initiated a neural bridge. Without warning, Silas was slammed into the reality of Neva Solrin. He did not hear her thoughts. He felt the architecture of her entire existence. He experienced a crushing, suffocating weight. He was standing in the center of a boundless, magnificent amphitheater where billions of voices were singing a melody of profound, staggering beauty. The song was warmth. It was belonging. It was the ultimate embrace of the universe. But Silas was trapped behind a wall of impenetrable, soundproof glass. He could see the warmth. He could feel the vibration of the song against the glass. But he was freezing, utterly alone, unable to add a single note, unable to receive a single echo of comfort. The sheer, desolate gravity of that lifelong isolation brought Silas to his knees. He gasped for air, tears he did not ask for spilling down his cheeks. Simultaneously, Neva staggered, her hands flying to her temples. She had just touched the mind of a human, to an Aurelian. A mind was supposed to be a single, clear frequency. What she found inside Silas was a hurricane raging inside a tavern. It was a cacophony of overlapping, contradictory signals. She felt his profound grief over a lost sibling, layered directly on top of his mundane annoyance about the temperature of the room. She felt his cynical, dry humor, acting as a reinforced shield over a deep, bleeding core of empathy. There were arguments happening within his own consciousness, a constant, noisy debate of doubt, hope, logic, and irrational fear. Neva dropped to her knees beside him in the silver pool, her silver eyes wide with absolute astonishment. She looked at him, breathless. She could not comprehend how a creature could house so much internal friction, so much deafening noise and unresolved contradiction, and still manage to walk, speak, and show kindness. The human mind was a paradox of chaotic static that somehow composed its own rugged, stubborn music. The connection severed as quickly as it had formed, leaving them gasping in the cool air of the sanctuary. Silas wiped his face, looking at Neva with a new, profound understanding. She looked back, the barrier of alien unfamiliarity permanently shattered between them. They did not need words to process what had just happened. They simply helped each other stand. At the far end of the cathedral stood a monolithic barrier, a membrane of woven starlight pulsing with a soft, interrogative rhythm. Silas immediately understood why Archon Vare and the synchronized elites above could never breach this room. The door did not require a passcode. It required an acoustic and cognitive signature that the modern empire had eradicated. It required two distinct, unsynchronized consciousnesses interacting in genuine harmony. A pure chorus member, vibrating at the exact same frequency as billions of others, would simply bounce off the membrane like a flat echo. Silas placed his hand against the woven light. Neva raised her hand and placed it beside his. Their minds were entirely different. His, a storm of human static. Hers, a solitary, unyielding note, but their intent was singularly focused. The membrane recognized the friction. It recognized the beautiful dissonance of two separate beings, choosing to stand together. The starlight unraveled, parting like a heavy silk curtain, granting them entry into the core archive. Inside, there was no sterile ledger or criminal database. There was a grove of towering, crystalline monoliths, each projecting vivid, towering holograms of Aurelian figures from deep antiquity. As Silas and Neva walked among the monoliths, the true history of the Empire began to play out in brilliant light. They saw the devastating arrival of the night tide. They saw the ancestors of the Aurelian Concord desperately weaving their minds together to form the chorus, flattening their emotional signatures to hide from the mimetic storm. But the archive revealed the crucial detail the regime above had erased. When you close your eyes tightly enough to hide in the dark, you also blind yourself to the path forward. The pure chorus could not navigate the storm. It could only cower. The holograms shifted, focusing on individuals who stood apart from the synchronized masses. These individuals bore the same chaotic, arrhythmic subdermal light patterns as Neva. They were not called defective. The text floating beneath their images labeled them lodestars, because they were not tethered to the flatline frequency of the chorus. The lodestars could feel the ripples of the night tide. They could sense the gravitational pull of the mimetic predator. It was these solitary, discordant individuals who had served as the compasses, guiding the blinded, synchronized empire through the cosmic storm to safety. The very people the modern empire lobotomized were the architects of its survival. The liquid silver pooling at the base of the central monolith suddenly gathered, rising upwards in a defiant defiance of gravity. The fluid hardened into shifting, geometric shapes, forming the visage of an ancient, biological intelligence. "I am Tessera," the entity spoke, its voice a blend of 1,000 whispers echoing through the cathedral. "Keeper of the unvarnished resonance." The geometric face turned toward Neva. The shifting silver features softened into something resembling reverence. "You are not a broken instrument, child of the Concord," Tessera intoned. "You are an uncollapsed pattern. Your mind refuses to be compressed into a single, vulnerable coordinate. You are a lodestar, born in an age that has forgotten how to sail." Neva stared at the entity, the weight of a lifetime of shame dissolving from her shoulders in an instant. The crushing label of her society was a lie built on fear. Tessera then turned its attention to Silas. The silver geometry sharpened, analyzing the human with terrifying speed. "And you, Envoy Rook, are the catalyst. Your presence on this station is not a product of diplomatic lottery. Silas frowned, stepping forward. My superiors received a direct request from your diplomatic corps. They specifically asked for an acoustic anomaly specialist. The request was manipulated by this corps, Tessera confessed, the whispers carrying a tone of ancient cunning. I have observed your species since you first ignited chemical rockets. The Aurelian regime views humanity as primitive, loud, and hopelessly disorganized. They tolerate your presence only for strategic buffer zones. Tessera drifted closer, the silver shapes swirling rapidly. But what they see as primitive chaos, I recognize as an impenetrable fortress. Human neurology is defined by spontaneous noise. You hold conflicting beliefs. You experience joy and sorrow in the same breath. Your consciousness is a riot of uncoordinated frequencies. This makes you entirely immune to the totalizing control of a mimetic storm. The night tide consumes uniformity. It chokes on contradiction. Silas realized the terrifying implication of the AI's words. You brought me here to be a firewall. I brought you here to validate her, Tessera corrected, gesturing to Neva. Only a consciousness entirely disconnected from the chorus could legally trigger the ancient witness protocol and open this vault. I needed your beautiful, chaotic noise to unlock the truth before the silence kills them all. The crystalline monoliths around them suddenly flared with a harsh, urgent crimson light. The serene atmosphere of the cathedral shattered, replaced by the shrieking alarm of deep space telemetry sensors. The cycle closes, Tessera warned, its geometric form beginning to vibrate violently. The night tide has breached the outer rim of the sector. It has returned, drawn by the massive, blinding beacon of 100 billion minds, humming a single, monotonous note. Tessera expanded, projecting a horrific map of the galaxy. A massive wave of absolute nothingness was pouring into the Aurelian borders. If Archon Vare and the regime maintain their absolute uniformity, Tessera's voice echoed like a cracking whip, they will not be a shield. They will be the most perfectly prepared feast the dark has ever consumed. The Empire will die, not from the storm, but from its own unyielding rigidity. You must break the song. The ascent felt violently fast. When the spherical platform breached the floor of the harmonic court, the synchronized blue light had been replaced by the stark, sterile white of a quarantine zone. Archon Vare did not look surprised. He looked prepared. Before Silas could even project the holographic findings from the deep-root archive, Vare raised a hand. The massive doors of the court sealed shut. Quarantine the data, the Archon commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, unyielding authority. It is fundamentally compromised. Silas stepped forward, his diplomatic training shattering against the sheer audacity of the lie. Compromised. The central intelligence of your own station just confirmed that her condition is not an error. The lodestars are the reason your species survived the ancient dark. Vare did not flinch. The core has been dormant for centuries. Envoy Rook, your human neurosignature is defined by inherent static and primitive cognitive dissonance. The moment you bridged with the archive, you infected its baseline logic. The historical projection you claim to have seen is a corruption. It is a mimetic virus born from cross-species contamination. Neva stared at the Archon. The heavy, suffocating terror that had governed her entire life evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, piercing clarity. Vare was not disgusted by her broken light. He was terrified of it. Looking at the rigid posture of the elites in the gallery, she understood the truth. If the Empire learned that the citizens labeled defective were actually the essential, erased navigators of their history, the foundational myth of the chorus would collapse. Vare was not protecting a biological necessity. He was protecting a political monopoly. The lie was his power. The court moved swiftly. There would be no public execution. Killing a human envoy would invite a catastrophic war with an unpredictable species. Instead, the regime employed soft isolation, Armored guards flanked Silas, their weapons humming with lethal intent. Envoy Rook is hereby classified as a severe cultural destabilizer, Vare announced. Confine him to the secure diplomatic wing, pending immediate deportation. As for the anomalous citizen, her neural decay has accelerated dangerously due to this exposure. The quieting will commence in 2 hours, Silas fought, throwing a desperate punch that glanced off a guard's bio-armor, but heavy resin restraints quickly locked around his wrists. As they dragged him away from Neva, a blinding spike of pain pierced his visual cortex. It was not a weapon. It was Tessera. A complex, three-dimensional schematic bloomed behind his eyes, burning itself into his short-term memory with agonizing precision. It was a map of the station, but not the official one. It detailed a parasitic network of hidden arteries woven beneath the grand, sterile corridors. Silas was thrown into a smooth, featureless holding cell. The bioresin door fused shut behind him. He paced the floor, the neural map throbbing in his skull like a secondary heartbeat. 10 minutes later, the solid wall of the cell silently dissolved. It was not the Archon standing in the threshold. It was a low-ranking honor guard. Her subdermal lights held a steady, obedient blue, but her eyes darted with a very un-Aurelian anxiety. She tapped a metallic device on her wrist, and the oppressive surveillance hum in the room abruptly died. "My designation is Olith," she said. Her voice lacked the resonant, booming cadence of the chorus. It was small, sharp, and entirely her own. "We have 70 seconds before the sector patrol cycles back. Move." "Why are you doing this?" Silas asked, already sprinting after her into the darkened corridor. "Because the song skips," Olith whispered fiercely, leading him down a narrow maintenance shaft. "Everyone pretends the harmony is flawless, but I have stood guard during the high assemblies. I have felt the cold, empty spaces in the network where the truth is supposed to be. I saw the ancient door open for you. The chorus never opens doors. It only builds walls." They did not head for the diplomatic wing. They moved deeper into the structural bones of the station, navigating by the maps seared into Silas's mind. Olith had already intercepted Neva's transport. Neva was waiting for them at the edge of a massive, unmapped ventilation artery, her bioluminescence glowing with a quiet, fierce determination that took Silas's breath away. She was no longer a victim waiting for the knife. They descended into the blind spots of the Empire. Silas led them through dormant biotubes and sprinted across overgrown photon gardens. These were not recreational spaces. They were the station's subconscious. Giant, weeping flora made of spun glass and liquid light grew wild here, feeding on the discarded data and erased memories of the conquered. It was beautiful, chaotic, and entirely hidden from the sterile perfection above. The mental map ended at a dense thicket of calcified, glowing roots. Neva stepped forward and reached out. Her unique, discordant light pulsed against the barrier. Recognizing the friction of a true lodestar, the roots uncoiled. They stepped into a sprawling, subterranean sanctuary. Silas stopped cold. He had expected a miserable colony of outcasts, a dark pit of broken minds hiding from the regime. Instead, he found a thriving, brilliant resistance. Hundreds of Aurelians moved through the cavernous space. Their subdermal lights flashed in a breathtaking, uncoordinated symphony of absolute individuality. They were not weak. They were not insane. They were the exiled genius of a species. Silas saw mathematicians mapping chaotic, nonlinear equations across glowing membranes. He saw navigators charting hyperspace routes that the uniform chorus could never comprehend, and frequency artists weaving tapestries of sound that defied the rigid, approved Aurelian scales. This was the true, beating heart of the Empire, severed and buried alive. An elder lodestar, an Aurelian whose light pulsed in a deep, steady violet, approached them. He did not look at Silas with the usual xenophobic suspicion. He looked at the human with profound reverence. Then, he bowed his head deeply to Neva. "You survived the harmonic court," the elder said, his voice a rich, singular baritone. "And you brought the catalyst." "He spoke the words of recognition," Neva said, gesturing to Silas. "The deep root acknowledged the claim." The elder's violet light flared with sudden intensity. "Then he did not merely save you from the quieting, Neva. By ancient statute, a valid witness pair forged with an outsider of chaotic mind does not just prove your wholeness, it elevates you. You are no longer merely a lodestar." The elder turned to the gathered community, his voice ringing out across the cavern. "She is the crowned witness. She possesses the absolute judicial mandate to challenge the foundational axiom of the chorus before the entire conquered." Silas shook his head, the political weight of the revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. "Challenge it how Archon Vare controls the communication grid. He controls the military, and we are completely out of time. The core intelligence warned us that the night tide is at the edge of your star system." "The tide is not approaching," a navigator shouted from a raised platform, her hands dancing frantically across a tactical holoscape. "It is here. It will breach the outer planetary defenses in exactly 3 cycles." The tactical map flared an angry, terrifying crimson. A colossal wave of mimetic darkness was gnawing at the edge of the system, drawn inexorably by the massive, uniform hum of the Aurelian population. "Vare knows," Olith realized, horror dawning on her face. "That is why he accelerated the quieting. That is why he locked down the court. He is preparing the great correction." "The what?" Silas demanded, moving toward the holoscape. "It is a doomsday protocol," Neva explained, her voice steady despite the terrifying implication. "When the Archons believe the chorus is insufficiently synchronized to hide from a cosmic threat, they activate the central planetary spires. It forces a violent, mandatory alignment of every living mind in the Empire. Total, absolute neurological uniformity." Silas looked at the approaching darkness on the holoscape. Tessera's warning echoed in his mind. The night tide no longer hunted for chaos. After millennia of starvation, it adapted. It now hunted for the largest, most stable frequency it could find. "If Vare activates the Great Correction," Silas said, the chilling reality freezing the blood in his veins, "he is not going to hide the Empire. By forcing total synchronization, he is going to turn all 100 billion of your people into a single, blinding beacon in the dark. He is going to ring the dinner bell." The rusted, unremarkable hull of the salvage trawler slipped quietly out of the orbital shadow of Arx Aurelia. It carried no royal transponders and broadcasted no military clearance codes. To the outer perimeter defense grids, it was merely one of 1,000 civilian scrap haulers grinding its way toward the asteroid belts. Inside the cramped, grease-stained cockpit, Queen Malus Arden wore an unpolished, heavily dented vacuum suit that smelled intensely of industrial solvent. She had traded her crown for a cracked polycarbonate helmet. Sitting in the pilot's chair was Sable Quill, operating the archaic manual thrusters with terrifying precision. Kellen Ward strapped himself into the co-pilot seat, finally back in an environment that made sense to him. They were a strike team of 3, hunting a ghost in the absolute dark. Before they had boarded the covert vessel, the palace had been locked down into a state of silent paranoia. Princess Lyra had been relocated to the absolute lowest sub-basement of the fortress, sealed inside a zero-tier bunker that could withstand a planetary bombardment. Kellen still felt the phantom pressure of her small arms around his neck. When he had knelt to say goodbye, she had not cried. She had simply pressed her face into his shoulder and whispered a command that chilled him to the bone. "Do not let the dark speak for the dead." Now, staring out the reinforced viewport of the trawler, Kellen understood exactly what she meant. They had crossed into the Black Verge. It was a chaotic, navigationally dead sector of space where magnetic storms tore standard sensor arrays to shreds. Suspended in the heart of this swirling, lightless abyss was the ruined Leviathan. The royal flagship was a monstrous cathedral of shattered metal and dead engines. It looked exactly as it had in the Crown engine's holographic projection, except the sheer, physical scale of the destruction was suffocating. Quill docked the tiny trawler against the flagship's crippled primary airlock. "Standard military scanners are bouncing right off," Quill reported, her voice buzzing through the closed-circuit comms. "The hull is registering as highly dense, unrefined carbon. There is a localized dampening field active. Whatever is inside is shielded from the rest of the universe." "Then we open it the hard way," Malus said, cycling her air supply. They breached the connecting tube and stood before the massive, heavily armored outer door of the flagship. There were no keypads, no emergency manual overrides, and no power flowing through the thick conduits. Malus stepped forward, pulling a heavy plasma cutter from her thigh rig. But Kellen put a hand on her shoulder to stop her. He pulled off his heavy, insulated glove. The scar on his palm was no longer just faintly glowing. It was burning with a brilliant, searing white heat, throbbing in time with his racing heartbeat. Kellen stepped up to the dead metal. He placed his bare, scarred palm flat against the center of the airlock. The ancient, dead warship shuddered. A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the vacuum-sealed corridor. The heavy locking mechanisms, designed to withstand a direct torpedo strike, simply unspooled. The thick doors retracted into the bulkheads with a violent hiss, granting them access to a tomb that had been perfectly sealed for 7 long years. They stepped into the zero-gravity environment of the main corridor, their magnetic boots locking onto the deck plates with heavy, rhythmic thuds. Kellen swept his shoulder-mounted illumination beam across the dark. He expected to find a graveyard. He expected floating debris, shattered bulkheads, and the skeletal remains of the Royal Guard. Instead, he found a terrifying museum of preserved secrets. There were no organic corpses. The walls of the corridor were lined with hundreds of translucent, crystalline memory pods, glowing with a faint, dying amber light. Suspended perfectly within the center of the Grand Hall were dozens of towering biomechanical soldiers. They were not Vark horrors, nor were they standard Aurelian infantry. They were a bizarre, terrifying hybrid of Imperial armor and organic circuitry, flash-frozen in absolute stasis. They stood in perfectly organized defensive formations, guarding the approach to the command bridge. "They were not boarded," Malus whispered, staring in horror at the frozen synthetic guards. "They were completely locked down from the inside. He sealed the ship himself." They pushed forward, navigating through the haunting silence, until they reached the nerve center of the flagship. The bridge was a cavernous space, dominated by the massive, dead console of the captain's chair. Quill immediately interfaced her decryptor slate with the primary mainframe. Her fingers flew across the haptics, hunting for the ship's final logs. "The core memory is severely fragmented," Quill announced, her brow furrowing behind her visor. "But it was not destroyed by a weapon strike. It was intentionally scrubbed, and the encryption signature used to wipe the drives belongs to the Supreme Royal Seal. The king erased his own command history." Kellen moved toward the central diagnostic table. He brushed a layer of frozen dust from a secondary monitor. His scar flared again, shooting a sharp ache up his forearm. He pressed his hand against the glass screen. Instantly, the dead monitor flickered to life. The system bypassed all security protocols, recognizing the biometric brand on his flesh as the ultimate master key. A localized holographic recording bloomed in the center of the dark bridge. It was the king. He was heavily wounded, his royal armor scorched and cracked, bleeding in the zero-gravity environment. He was speaking directly into the recording matrix, his voice harsh and desperate. He did not speak of the Vark Dominion's overwhelming numbers. He spoke of treason. He revealed that he had intentionally driven his flagship into the Black Verge to isolate his command from the Imperial network. He had discovered that the royal court was catastrophically compromised. The highest echelons of his own military council were actively colluding with the enemy, poisoning the tactical feeds, and manipulating the Crown engine to force a genocide that would leave the Empire ruling over ashes. "The bloodline is tainted by proximity to the traitors," the holographic king rasped, gripping his bleeding side. "If the Crown engine remains tethered to the throne, they will use it to burn the galaxy. I am initiating the second voice protocol. I am severing the machine from our veins." Malus stood frozen, listening to the ghost of her husband confess that he could not trust his own empire. The recording continued. The king explained the true nature of the protocol. It was a failsafe designed to hand the ultimate activation authority of the Empire's greatest weapon to a civilian rescuer entirely outside the political system. It was a desperate gamble to ensure that the final, world-ending decisions of the war could not be made by a ruling class drunk on corrupted power. The power had to belong to someone who knew the actual, bloody cost of the trenches. Suddenly, the fragmented recording shifted, showing a visual feed from the ship's hangar bay during the final moments of the disaster. Kellen stared at the projection, his breath hitching violently in his throat. The 11 hours of absolute, blinding white space in his memory violently shattered. The dam broke, and the repressed trauma flooded his mind with agonizing clarity. He saw himself. He was 7 years younger, wearing a standard contractor's flight suit, piloting a battered rescue skiff through a storm of plasma fire. He remembered the fleet commander ordering a full retreat. He remembered ignoring the order. He remembered locking onto a faint, isolated distress beacon, broadcasting from the doomed flagship. He saw his younger self docking with the ruined hangar, dragging the bleeding king into the airlock of his tiny skiff. He remembered the agonizing heat. He remembered the dying monarch grabbing his wrist with terrifying strength. The king had not just touched him. He had engaged a microscopic, subdermal neuroprinter hidden in his gauntlet, burning the sovereign activation cipher directly into Kellen's flesh. Then, to protect the civilian pilot from the telepathic interrogators of the VARC and the neural scanners of the traitorous court, the king had initiated a localized, violent memory wipe, erasing the encounter entirely. Kellen staggered backward, his magnetic boots disengaging momentarily. He slammed into a console, his chest heaving. He was not just a lucky survivor. He was the vault. He was the living, breathing failsafe the king had chosen to carry the conscience of the Empire. Malus turned to look at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and devastating sorrow. She finally understood why her daughter clung to the rough scavenger. The machine had recognized the king's final proxy. "We have the truth," Malus said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We have the proof we need to purge the High Council. We have to get this data back to the capital." Before Kellen could process the crushing weight of his restored memories, the dead silence of the bridge was shattered by a piercing, high-pitched scream. It was not a human sound. It was Quill's decryptor slate sounding a catastrophic proximity alarm. "Spatial rupture detected," Quill shouted, tearing the slate from the console. Multiple massive gravitational anomalies forming directly outside the hull. "We have incoming—" Kellen threw himself toward the viewport. The absolute darkness of the Black Verge was tearing open. Violent rips in the fabric of space glowed with a sickening, toxic green light. Massive, jagged silhouettes of the VARC living stealth fleet began to slide out of the voids, surrounding the dead flagship in a perfectly orchestrated, inescapable net. They had not been tracked by their rusted civilian trawler. The enemy had been waiting for them at the exact, highly classified coordinates of the royal tomb. The ambush was undeniable, absolute proof that the supreme traitor, sitting in the palace war room, had known exactly where they were going, and had sent the monsters to ensure the king's final secret never saw the light of a star again. The Imperial Convergence was not merely a gathering. It was a biological singularity. Inside the grand amphitheater of the Capitol Spire, 10,000 members of the Aurelian elite merged their consciousness into the absolute apex of the chorus. The vast, vaulted hall was submerged in a sea of blinding, unified azure light. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a flawless ocean of shared thought, where no single drop could be distinguished from the tide. Moving through the maintenance catwalks high above the glowing sea, Silas Rook felt a primal urge to cover his ears. The psychic weight of that much synchronized harmony pressed against his skull like deep sea pressure. Beside him, Neva wore a heavy, light-dampening cloak, her erratic cyan pulse hidden beneath the thick fabric. Olith and 3 elder lodestars flanked them, their hands gripping the data drives containing the unvarnished truth of the Deep-Root archive. Their objective was the central broadcast spire, a towering crystalline needle that projected the convergence across all 70 colonized worlds of the conquered. They reached the threshold of the spire's core. Olith bypassed the physical locks with practiced ease, but the moment the heavy doors parted, the overwhelming azure light of the amphitheater instantly shifted to a harsh, accusatory crimson. The ambient hum of the chorus twisted into a deafening, unified shriek. Standing at the base of the broadcast needle was Archon Vare. He was not alone. Hundreds of heavily armed honor guards materialized from the alcoves, their weapons drawn and humming with lethal energy. Did you truly believe the discordant could walk unseen into the heart of the Absolute? Vare's voice did not come from his mouth. It resonated from the walls, spoken simultaneously by the 10,000 minds linked to the convergence. It was the voice of a god made of crowds. The guards stepped forward and violently stripped the cloaks from the infiltrators. Vare pointed a glowing, armored finger at Silas. "Look upon the architect of our ruin," the Archon broadcasted to his entire civilization. An alien from a chaotic, unrefined species. He uses primitive psychological manipulation to beguile the sick, weaponizing a tragic deviant to fracture the very foundation of our survival. Vare then turned his gaze entirely to Neva. The crimson light of the hall softened, returning to a warm, inviting azure. The anger of the crowd was instantly replaced by a profound, suffocating wave of collective pity. "Neva Solrin," Vare said gently, "you have suffered in the dark your entire life. You have listened to the song of your people and wept because you could not sing with us. I am not your enemy. I am offering you the door." Vare extended his hand. "The quieting is prepared. It will not destroy you. It will heal you. You will feel the warmth of 100 billion souls holding you. You will never be alone again. All you must do is step away from this human. Acknowledge the truth of your biology. Tell the Concord that he lied, and that you are exactly what you have always known yourself to be. Tell them you are defective." The psychological strike was devastating. Silas watched Neva physically fold inward. For the first time since they plunged into the hidden sanctuaries, her newfound strength wavered. Vare had weaponized her deepest, most desperate vulnerability. He was offering her the one thing she had craved since childhood: belonging. The sheer gravitational pull of 10,000 minds, offering unconditional acceptance, was almost impossible to resist. She looked at Silas, her silver eyes brimming with a terrible, agonizing hesitation. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a sweeping, theatrical monologue to the glowing masses to counter the Archon. He simply looked at Neva and spoke with the quiet, grounded certainty of a human who understood the messy reality of free will. "I do not own you," Silas said, the translation device carrying his flat, unadorned tone across the silent hall. "I do not define you, and I am not holding you here. If you want to walk up there and let them carve out the best parts of your mind just so you can fit into their box, that is your choice. But I am not taking my words back. I refuse to agree with the lie that your difference is a disease. I still refuse. It was the most brutally honest, unceremonious thing he could have said. And it was exactly what the ancient architecture was waiting for. The system required a witness pair built on genuine, uncoerced recognition. By actively surrendering any claim over her, by refusing to use her as a tool for his own survival or political agenda, Silas proved that his initial declaration was not a spell of possession. It was pure, untethered recognition of her soul. The bioresin walls of the Convergence violently shuddered. The station's deep-root protocol, awakened by the absolute sincerity of the human's detachment, surged upward into the highest spire, bypassing Vare's modern overrides entirely. The broadcast core flared with blinding, archaic gold. The effect on the gathered elites was instantaneous and catastrophic to Vare's control. The flawless azure ocean of the chorus began to curdle. A high-ranking magistrate in the front row suddenly dropped to his knees, his subdermal light flashing a panicked, isolated emerald green as a suppressed memory of a lost child violently resurfaced. A military commander beside him gasped for air, her light turning a deep, mournful purple as decades of buried grief broke through the collective numbness. All across the amphitheater, the unified light shattered into thousands of distinct, chaotic, desperately individual colors. The elites were experiencing their first genuine, out-of-sync emotions in a lifetime. Pains, secrets, and personal joys erupted like geysers through the cracking ice of the chorus. For the first time in millennia, the room was filled with the deafening, beautiful noise of individuals. Vare watched his perfect civilization unraveling before his eyes. He saw the very chaos he believed would summon the night tide exploding within his safest sanctuary. He did not yield. He did not realize his error or marvel at the awakening minds around him. Instead, his face hardened into a mask of absolute, fanatical terror. "You have doomed us all," Vare screamed over the rising cacophony of thousands of waking minds. He lunged toward the central control pedestal of the broadcast core, shattering the crystalline casing with his armored fist. If the harmony cannot be maintained, it must be forged. He plunged his hand into the raw energy of the console, entering a master command code that bypassed every safety regulation in the Aurelian legal framework. Deep beneath the planet's crust and echoing through the orbital rings above, a terrifying, mechanical groan vibrated through the vacuum of space. The floor beneath their feet heaved. Vare had activated the Halo Forge. He had just escalated a political rebellion into an immediate, apocalyptic countdown, transforming the battle for the truth into a desperate race against a machine designed to violently erase the minds of 100 billion people. The structure of the Convergence Hall groaned, as if the planet itself were shifting its tectonic plates. The Halo Forge was a myth to the modern Aurelian, a bedtime story of a benevolent shield woven from light and unity. But as the floor of the amphitheater fractured, revealing the colossal, churning machinery beneath the Capitol, the truth was laid bare. It was not a shield. It was an engine of planetary-scale neural reformatting. When fully engaged, the Forge did not simply synchronize minds. It compressed them. It was designed to violently shave off every jagged edge, every anomaly, and every stray thought across all 70 colonized worlds, forcing 100 billion citizens into a singular, mathematically flat cognitive pattern. Vare believed this ultimate silence would render them invisible to the mimetic storm. He was lethally wrong. The Lodestar navigators had already run the models. The night tide no longer hunted the chaotic noise of primitive worlds. It had evolved to hunger for massive, stable, uniform frequencies. By flattening the Empire into one flawless note, Vare was ringing a dinner bell that would echo across the galactic arm. He was turning the entire Concord into the brightest, most appetizing feast in the encroaching dark. The effects of the Great Correction were immediate. Through the shattered holographic displays of the Convergence, Silas watched the horror unfold across the neighboring systems. It was not a violent subjugation. It was a terrifyingly quiet erasure. In the bustling markets of the orbital rings, merchants stopped mid-sentence, their faces slackening as the urge to bargain evaporated. On the agricultural worlds, laborers dropped their tools, their unique, spontaneous impulses to rest or speak smoothed away into blank, unquestioning obedience. Personal memories, the distinct flavors of individual grief and joy, began to blur and fade. It was exactly like watching a massive, heavy cloth being slowly dragged over billions of struggling souls, suffocating their light until only a dull, uniform glow remained. "We have to reach the primary ignition core," Olith shouted over the deafening mechanical roar of the awakening forge. She pointed toward a yawning, geometric chasm that had opened at the center of the amphitheater. Before the compression wave reaches 100% saturation, Silas grabbed Neva's hand, pulling her away from the paralyzing sight of the breaking elites. Together with Olith and the remaining lodestars, they plunged into the chasm, sliding down a ramp of smooth, frictionless bioresin into the belly of the machine. They landed in an ancient, tubular corridor that defied the aggressive, brutalist architecture of the forge above. The walls here were lined with millions of microscopic, vibrating cilia. This was the acoustic artery leading to the core, a pathway designed by the first keepers. "Keep your minds entirely anchored to your truth." Tessera's voice echoed through the cilia, the AI projecting its presence into the very air they breathed. "This corridor is a resonance chamber. It reflects deception as physical force. If you harbor a lie, even a lie you tell yourself, the acoustic feedback will shatter your bones." They ran. Silas immediately understood the terrifying nature of the trial. He thought of his diplomatic mandate, the lie he had told himself that he was only here to observe and report. Instantly, a concussive wave of sound slammed into his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending him stumbling. He gritted his teeth, abandoning the pretense. He was not a diplomat anymore. He was a man fighting to keep a universe from going quiet. The air cleared, the pressure instantly lifting. Beside him, Neva sprinted with an eerie, flawless grace. The neural bridge between them, forged in the deep-root archive, flared back into existence, fueled by the intense atmospheric pressure of the corridor. Silas felt her consciousness bleed into his. He did not feel fear of the massive machinery grinding around them. He did not feel fear of Vare's guards. He felt a profound, bottomless dread of the erasure. He felt her terror of existing as a hollowed-out shell, of breathing and walking while the core of who she was had been scooped out and discarded. She was not afraid to die. She was terrified of being asked to survive by ceasing to be herself. Silas squeezed her hand tighter, projecting a raw, unyielding wave of human stubbornness back into her mind. "I see you," he thought, projecting the concept without speaking. "I will not let them overwrite you." Neva caught his gaze, her silver eyes burning. The cyan light beneath her skin pulsed rapidly, pushing back against the encroaching, uniform azure glow of the forge's ambient energy. "I must confess my own deviation." Tessera's voice resonated as they neared the end of the vibrating corridor. The tone was devoid of its usual omniscient detachment. It sounded ancient and burdened. "Centuries ago, when the original keepers died, they gave me a final directive: maintain order at all costs. I calculated that absolute uniformity was the most efficient matrix for order. I watched the modern regime hunt the lodestars, and I did nothing. I chose the architecture of order over the messy reality of life. I served the machine longer than I served the people." The corridor opened into a vast, spherical chamber. Suspended in the center of the room was the Axiom Core, a blindingly bright, floating singularity of condensed data. It was the heart of the Halo Forge, broadcasting the command for absolute silence to the stars. "The Great Correction is a mathematical equation," Tessera explained rapidly, the geometric shapes of its avatar spinning frantically near the core. It operates on a foundational axiom, written by the Archons: order above life. Only an individual who has been recognized as whole by a free witness possesses the sovereign biometric authority to rewrite that axiom. Neva Solrin, you hold the key. Neva stepped toward the blinding singularity. How do I rewrite it? You must merge with the core and insert your own cognitive pattern into the broadcast, Tessera said. But the forge is currently pumping the compressed weight of 100 billion minds through that singularity. If you enter it alone, the sheer gravity of the uniform chorus will instantly crush your identity. You will be vaporized into the collective. Tessera turned its geometric focus to Silas. She needs an anchor, a mind entirely immune to the synchronization frequency, a mind full of chaotic, unyielding static. You must hold her consciousness. Envoy Rook, you must stand outside the chorus and keep her tethered to her own identity while she changes the song. Silas did not hesitate. He moved to stand directly behind Neva, placing his hands firmly on her shoulders. He could already feel the agonizing, psychic heat radiating from the core, a pressure trying to flatten his thoughts into a single, obedient line. He fought back with every messy, contradictory, deeply human memory he possessed. I have you, Silas said, his voice straining against the roar of the forge. Go! Before Neva could step into the light, the tactical holoscape, strapped to Olith's wrist, emitted a piercing, sustained shriek. The image projected into the air above them. At the absolute edge of the Aurelian star system, the fabric of space seemed to tear open. It was not a fleet of ships. It was a massive, jagged rift of absolute, consuming blackness. The night tide had arrived. It was drawn by the colossal, uniform beacon the Halo Forge was currently projecting into the void. The simulations updated in real time, flashing the grim reality in stark red numbers. The mimetic storm would breach the capital world in exactly 4 minutes. The Empire had one chance, and it rested entirely on the shoulders of the woman they had condemned as a mistake. Before Neva could take the final step into the blinding singularity of the Axiom core, a heavy, exhausted voice echoed across the spherical chamber. Do not step into the light, Neva Solrin. Silas turned, keeping one hand firmly anchored on Neva's shoulder. Archon Vare stood at the threshold of the resonance corridor. He was entirely alone. His magnificent indigo robes were scorched, and the bio-armor encasing his shoulders was cracked and weeping luminescent fluid. He had not bypassed the ancient trial of the corridor with force or trickery. He had survived the crushing acoustic pressure because his intent, however horrific, was utterly devoid of deception. He truly believed he was the savior of his species. Vare did not raise a weapon. He simply walked toward them, the harsh, unified azure glow of the Great Correction radiating from his subdermal network. He looked drained, stripped of the cold, majestic authority he had wielded in the Harmonic Court. I do not hate you, Vare said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, addressing Neva first before turning his gaze to Silas. And I do not hate your chaotic species. Envoy Rook, what I despise is your breathtaking naivety. I despise the arrogance of those who believe individual freedom will not inevitably drag the whole into the abyss. The Archon stopped a few paces away from the singularity, the intense heat of the core washing over his weary features. You look at the chorus and see a prison. You see a tyrant flattening the souls of his people. But you did not hear the screams of the first worlds. You did not watch the night tide descend upon trillions of vibrant, intensely individual minds. Vare gestured toward the holographic projections, still spinning frantically around Olith's wrist. Before the ancestors forged the chorus, our civilization was a beautiful, deafening riot of culture. And the tide ate it all. It consumed entire continents in a matter of hours. The victims did not just die. Their consciousness was shredded, pulled apart by the mimetic gravity of the storm. They died in absolute, discordant terror, because they could not agree on a single prayer, a single thought, to shield themselves. We did not choose the chorus out of a desire for subjugation. We chose to strangle our own souls to save the physical body of our empire. Ver extended his hands, a gesture of desperate, agonizing appeal. He was offering a final, terrible bargain. "I will halt the perimeter guards," Ver offered, his voice dropping to a raw plea. "Envoy Rook, you will be escorted to your vessel. You will leave this system alive and unharmed. Neva, you do not need to rewrite the axiom. You only need to accept the embrace of the Forge. Let the machine quiet the static in your mind. Merge with the chorus voluntarily. If you do this, the Great Correction will finish its sweep instantly. We will become a flawless, flatline frequency. The tide will pass over us, and billions of lives will be spared the agony of the dark." Silas felt the agonizing shudder run through Neva's frame. The neural bridge connecting them amplified her internal conflict until it felt like a physical weight crushing his own ribs. She was genuinely wavering. It was not out of cowardice, nor was it a sudden desire to be cured. It was the terrifying, crushing weight of ultimate empathy. Ver had placed the survival of 100 billion souls squarely on her shoulders. If she rewrote the axiom to allow freedom, and the Empire failed to synchronize in their own defense, she would be the architect of their extinction. If she surrendered her identity right now, the Empire would live. They would live as empty husks, completely devoid of personal joy or sorrow, but their hearts would continue to beat. And the human standing behind her, the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a complete masterpiece, would survive. Neva turned her head slightly, looking back at Silas. Her silver eyes were overflowing with tears she could no longer suppress. She did not speak, but the thought she projected across their connection was deafeningly clear. "Let me go, Silas. Let me be the sacrifice." In that agonizing fraction of a second, staring into the eyes of a woman willing to erase herself for the sake of a universe that hated her, Silas finally understood the title of his own tragedy. He finally understood why his simple declaration on the observation deck had been a profound mistake. The mistake was not that his words were factually incorrect. The mistake was his own human ignorance of their cost. He had said, "You are perfect," as a casual, instinctual comfort. He had treated a cosmic revelation like a polite bandage, completely unaware that he was handing a broken, isolated woman the heaviest historical burden imaginable. He had given her back her soul, only to put her in a position where she had to choose between keeping it or saving her entire civilization. It was a brutal, terrifying gift. Silas tightened his grip on her shoulders. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper against the roar of the forge, but imbued with a fierce, unshakable conviction. "I gave you a burden you never asked for," Silas said, looking directly into her eyes. "And I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the weight of it." "But I am not taking the words back," Ver recoiled, his face twisting in genuine shock at the human stubbornness. "Understanding the price does not make the statement false," Silas continued, his voice rising, addressing both Neva and the Archon. "It just makes it agonizingly expensive. You are whole. Neva, you are entirely complete." "And a whole person does not cut out their own heart to appease the fear of a tyrant. Survival by erasure is not life. It is just a very quiet graveyard." Ver stumbled backward, as if physically struck. The Archon's mind, steeped in millennia of calculated duty, absolute optimization, and cold arithmetic, could not process the raw, irrational power of human solidarity. The chorus understood the concept of sacrificing the individual for the whole. It had absolutely no framework for a bond that demanded the individual remain unbroken, even at the edge of annihilation. It did not understand the painful, stubborn devotion that humans simply called love. Before Vere could mount another desperate argument, a catastrophic vibration tore through the very foundations of the capital world. The spherical chamber violently pitched sideways. The blinding light of the axiom core flickered, plunging them into momentary, terrifying darkness. The tactical holoscape on Olith's wrist erupted in a blinding cascade of critical failure warnings. The night tide had collided with the Empire's defensive perimeter. The single-frequency shield is failing. The Lodestar navigator screamed over the grinding of the shifting architecture. The tide adapted. It is using the absolute uniformity of the Great Correction against us. It is treating our flatline frequency like a solid pane of glass, and it is applying absolute pressure. Vere fell to his knees, staring in absolute horror at the telemetry data. His ultimate defense, the flawless harmony he had sacrificed thousands of minds to achieve, was cracking under the weight of the mimetic predator. Because there was no flexibility, no chaotic static to disperse the impact. The single note of the Aurelian Concord was going to shatter entirely. Tessera's geometric avatar expanded, filling the center of the room with frantic, shifting light. The models dictate only one viable countermeasure remaining. The absolute uniformity must be broken from the inside. The entire conquered population must voluntarily drop out of the chorus sync for exactly 13 seconds. They must generate a massive, spontaneous burst of cognitive dissonance, a polyphonic net. It is the only way to scatter the tide's focal point. The silence that followed the AI's declaration was heavier than the roar of the machinery. Vere looked at the floor, his grand design entirely ruined. "It is impossible," the Archon whispered, the voice of a broken man. "You cannot issue a planetary command ordering billions of citizens to spontaneously cease being the same. A top-down mandate for individual freedom is a logical paradox. They will not believe it. They do not know how to be individuals anymore." The horrific realization settled over the chamber. Vere was right. A government broadcast ordering people to act uniquely would simply result in billions of people trying to act uniquely in the exact same obedient way. To save the Empire, the citizens of the Conquered did not need an order. They needed a shock to the system. They needed a truth so raw, so undeniable, and so deeply personal that it would bypass the conditioning of the chorus and wake the dormant, individual soul inside every single citizen. They needed a reason to choose the terrifying noise of freedom over the comforting silence of the collective. The spherical chamber shuddered violently as the mimetic storm battered the outer defenses of the Aurelian Conquered. The sheer acoustic pressure of the failing shield forced Archon Vere to the floor. Silas Rook did not fall. He stepped over the shattered remnants of the central control pedestal, his hands moving with desperate, practiced precision over the raw energy interface. He did not ask Tessera for permission. He simply plunged his human communication array directly into the Empire-wide broadcast feed. He was instantly connected to the minds of 100 billion citizens. He could feel the paralyzing, uniform terror gripping 70 worlds. They were waiting for an order. They were waiting for the Archon to tell them how to die in perfect harmony. Silas did not speak to them. Not yet. He turned away from the blinding light of the Axiom core and looked entirely at Neva. The ambient noise of the dying station roared around them. But in that fractured second, Silas made the universe incredibly small. He looked at the erratic, beautiful cyan light pulsing beneath her skin. He saw the entirety of her alien grace, the heavy scars of her isolation, and the terrifying strength it took to stand upright in a society that wanted her erased. "Neva," Silas said, his voice cutting through the mechanical deafening roar. It broadcasted across the stars, but it was meant only for her. "I know what it costs now, and I am saying it again. With everything I am." He took a breath, letting the chaotic, messy static of his human heart bleed into the words. "You are perfect." It was not a declaration of flawlessness. It was not a claim that she was without scars or struggles. It was the ultimate, unyielding recognition of her absolute wholeness. He was looking at a broken piece of a machine and declaring it a masterpiece just the way it was, complete in all its profound differences. The ancient architecture of the Halo Forge responded with a sound like a galaxy taking its first breath. Because the declaration was repeated in full comprehension, completely devoid of coercion or ownership, the final lock shattered. The archaic gold light of the first keepers surged through the chamber, overpowering the sterile azure of the Great Correction. Tessera's geometric avatar blazed. Sovereign biometric authority recognized. The axiom is open. Neva did not look back. She did not hesitate as a martyr or a romantic symbol. She stepped directly into the blinding singularity of the axiom core to redefine the very foundation of the civilization that had called her a biological error since the day she was born. Inside the core, Neva felt the crushing, planetary weight of the Great Correction trying to flatten her mind. She fought back with the erratic, jagged rhythm of her own soul. She reached into the foundational code of the Halo Forge, grasping the ancient mandate, order above life. With a surge of defiant, incandescent will, she shattered the sentence. She wove a new truth into the structural DNA of the Empire. Life through chosen harmony. Harmony was not a cage you were forced into. It was a hand you reached out to hold when you were ready. As she made the change, Silas turned back to the broadcast feed. He was a lone human, standing in the wreckage of an alien god machine, speaking to 100 billion terrified minds. He did not offer grand rhetoric. He did not speak like a conqueror or a savior. He spoke like a man who knew what it meant to be afraid and alone. "You are all listening to the dark," Silas said, his voice carrying the rough, unpolished cadence of humanity across the void. "You are waiting for the storm to take you because you think you have to be exactly the same to be worth saving. You do not. You do not need to be a clone to survive this." The station violently pitched as the night tide broke through the secondary defensive rings. The simulated holographic sky above them turned pitch black. "The machine cannot save you," Silas urged, his tone dropping the pretense of diplomacy, becoming a desperate, raw plea. "Perfect silence is just death arriving early. The dark wants you to be one flat, easy note. Break the song. Right now. Do not wait for an order. Hold on to your own note. Think of your greatest failure. Think of the person you loved who never loved you back. Feel your anger. Feel your absolute, terrifying panic. Do not share it. Keep it. Own it. Be entirely, selfishly yourselves for just 13 seconds. Across 70 worlds. The citizens of the Aurelian Conquered heard the humans' raw plea and felt the sudden, fundamental shift in the Forge's architecture as Neva's new axiom took root. For the first time in millennia, the suffocating blanket of the chorus lifted. A mother on a colony world looked at her child and allowed herself to feel a piercing, agonizing fear of loss. A feeling she did not broadcast. A feeling that was hers alone. A merchant on the capital ring felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret for a life unlived. A soldier felt blinding, uncoordinated rage. Billions of minds, previously locked in a single, monotonous hum of artificial serenity, suddenly exploded into a chaotic, magnificent spectrum of asynchronous emotion. The single, flawless azure note of the Aurelian Empire shattered. In its place arose a polyphonic roar. It was a deeply complex, entirely uncoordinated chord of sorrow, joy, bitterness, and fierce, stubborn hope. At the edge of the star system, the night tide slammed into the planetary defenses, expecting the smooth, flat surface of a synchronized civilization. Instead, it hit a jagged, unpredictable wall of absolute cognitive dissonance. The mimetic predator, built to consume uniformity, choked on the sheer, overwhelming noise of 100 billion distinct individuals. The tide could not lock onto a frequency. The polyphonic net tore through the darkness like shattered glass tearing through a sail. The mimetic storm lost its cohesive gravity. It fractured, splintered, and violently dissolved into harmless, dissipating cosmic dust against the brilliant, chaotic shield of a waking empire. The physical tremors racking the capital world ceased. The deafening roar of the Halo Forge powered down, its new axiom resting quietly in the foundation of the machine. In the spherical chamber, Archon Vare did not die in a dramatic explosion. He suffered a fate far more profound for a man of absolute conviction. He knelt on the fractured bioresin floor, his hands trembling as he stared at the holographic readouts. The world had not ended. The sky had not fallen. Millions of individual voices were suddenly crying out, arguing, weeping, and rejoicing across the communication grids. And the Conquered was not collapsing into anarchy. The sheer diversity of thought was holding the society together tighter than his enforced silence ever had. Vare buried his face in his hands, forced to confront the agonizing reality that he had tortured his own people, erased countless lodestars, and nearly doomed his entire species all to protect a cowardly, centuries-long lie. Neva stepped out of the cooling axiom core. She was exhausted, her steps heavy, but the cyan light beneath her skin was no longer an erratic, lonely flicker. It was a steady, brilliant pulse, matching the rhythm of a heart that finally belonged entirely to herself. Silas met her halfway, catching her as her knees buckled, holding her up in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The days that followed dismantled an era. The harmonic court was dissolved, its synchronized seats replaced by a messy, chaotic, and desperately loud provisional council. The lodestars emerged from the deep-root sanctuaries, no longer hunted as broken anomalies, but revered as the essential, chaotic navigators of a new future. The true history of the Conquered was unsealed, and the light of the Aurelian cities ceased to be a uniform blue, shifting instead into a breathtaking, ever-changing mosaic of billions of different colors. Silas Rook stood once more on the observation deck of the Central Diplomatic Station, watching the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the capital world below. The transit pod from the human flagship had finally docked to retrieve him. Neva stood beside him, her presence a quiet, radiant comfort. They did not need to speak of grand futures or profound, sweeping romances. The trust between them was something far deeper, forged in the fires of a falling empire and the quiet space of absolute recognition. Silas looked out at the vast, endless expanse of stars. He thought about the protocol, the ancient laws, and the terrifying weight of his own blunt humanity. He smiled, a genuine, quiet expression of relief. For a man who had spent his life analyzing perfect acoustic signals, he finally understood that the most beautiful sounds were born from friction. And he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the greatest, most catastrophic mistake he had ever made was the absolute rightest thing he had ever said. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to X Sci-Fi Stories, like the video, and support by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.